The conversation is already moving when you arrive. Nothing formal yet, just a few senior leaders discussing a shift that might happen next quarter. New budget allocation, a possible restructuring, a project that could redefine priorities. You listen carefully. You understand the implications quickly. So you do what competent professionals usually do. You begin solving the problem. You outline operational adjustments. You suggest implementation steps. You point out where friction might appear. The room appreciates the clarity. But something else just happened. Heads nod. Someone says, "Good point." Then something subtle happens. The discussion moves forward, but not through you. The direction of the conversation stabilizes somewhere slightly above your contribution. Your ideas were useful, your reasoning was correct, but influence did not move. Nothing hostile occurred, no one dismissed you. Yet, when the decision eventually forms, your role becomes implementation, not direction. Most professionals experience this moment repeatedly, and they usually misdiagnose it. They assume the issue is persuasion. They think, "I need stronger arguments. I need to communicate more strategically. I need to show leadership more clearly." But persuasion is rarely the problem. Timing is. Because in most hierarchies, power is not assigned when decisions appear. It is assigned long before they become visible. And once a decision reaches the room, the gravitational positions inside that room are already established. That is the first inversion most professionals never see. Influence does not emerge when pressure arrives. Influence determines who the system listens to when pressure arrives. Which means by the time a high-stakes conversation begins, authority has already been quietly distributed. The visible discussion is only the final stage. The architecture of influence formed earlier, and if you begin positioning yourself for power only when the stakes become obvious, you are already late. Not slightly late, structurally late. Because hierarchy rarely evaluates authority during resolution, it evaluates authority during formation. Formation happens long before most people notice. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Most professionals believe influence grows from performance. Performance does matter, but performance mainly produces credibility. Credibility does not automatically produce directional authority. Directional authority forms when the system begins associating your thinking with future uncertainty, not past output. Hierarchy constantly evaluates a silent question. When complexity increases, whose interpretation helps the system orient itself? Not who worked hardest, not who executed flawlessly, who the system believes can interpret ambiguity before it becomes crisis. That belief forms slowly, through repeated exposure to how you think, not only what you deliver. And here is where most professionals unknowingly narrow their own positioning. They expose the system to their work. Watch the behavioral signals closely. When ambiguity appears, you offer solutions quickly. You clarify execution steps. You remove friction. The room appreciates the efficiency. But what the system records is different. Each intervention becomes a reaction receipt, evidence that when uncertainty appears, you stabilize outcomes rather than define them. Reaction receipts accumulate, and the system is always recording. And hierarchy rarely debates accumulated pattern evidence. They expose the system to their effort. They expose the system to their reliability, but they rarely expose the system to their interpretation, which means hierarchy observes their execution without observing their orientation. Execution demonstrates competence. Orientation demonstrates directional potential. Those are not the same signal. Execution solves problems that already exist. Orientation reveals how future problems should be understood. Hierarchy separates those signals carefully, and once that separation stabilizes, influence becomes asymmetrical. Executors become trusted. Architects become influential. Both roles are necessary. Only one expands positional gravity. Now, pause for a moment. Think about the last major decision that happened in your organization. A restructuring, a product shift, a strategic initiative. Ask yourself a simple question. When did the people who shaped that decision actually start influencing it? During the official meeting? Or months earlier, in conversations most people ignored? Because most professionals only notice the visible arena, the presentation, the strategy session, the executive meeting. But those arenas are often confirmation stages, not formation stages. By the time a proposal reaches the visible arena, the internal map of influence is already formed. The system already knows who stabilizes execution, who absorbs operational friction, who interprets uncertainty, who defines direction. Those roles are rarely announced. They are inferred. And inference is built from patterns, which leads to a second inversion. Power rarely emerges from moments. It emerges from patterns. Moments only reveal patterns the system already trusts. That is why some individuals appear to gain influence suddenly when pressure rises. It looks like recognition happening in real time, but recognition usually began months earlier, long before the room realized it. When ambiguity rises, people instinctively orient toward familiar interpretive anchors. They ask themselves quietly, who has framed similar complexity before? Who understands the trade-offs behind this? Whose interpretation has previously clarified uncertainty? That person becomes a gravitational reference. And gravitational reference is the beginning of power. Notice the distinction carefully. Some people in an organization attract tasks. Others attract interpretation. When problems appear, tasks move toward executors. But when uncertainty appears, attention moves toward interpreters. Those are two different gravitational poles. Task gravity produces workload. Interpretive gravity produces influence. Most professionals spend their careers strengthening task gravity. They become dependable, reliable, efficient, capable of stabilizing operational pressure. These traits are valuable. They make the system function. But stabilizing execution is not the same as shaping direction. And if your behavioral signals consistently reinforce execution, the system optimizes around placing you where execution is required, which means your reliability becomes containment. Every system maintains an invisible ledger, not financial, behavioral. Call it the access ledger. It tracks who the structure consults for interpretation and who it deploys for resolution. Executors receive task access. Interpreters receive directional access. The ledger updates quietly. Each time you resolve friction before defining the problem, the system records another entry, another confirmation of where your gravity belongs. Not because anyone intends to limit you, because systems stabilize around predictable utility. The more predictably useful you are within a defined function, the less incentive the structure has to reposition you. Repositioning introduces uncertainty. Stability removes it. Hierarchy protects stability whenever possible. So when you attempt to demonstrate influence during a decision moment, you are often attempting to override a pattern that is already stabilized. Which is why persuasion feels strangely ineffective. You are not arguing against people. You are arguing against pattern recognition. And patterns are difficult to change in a single moment. They require repeated exposure to new signals. There is a structural pattern operating here that most professionals never see. This leads to the core principle most professionals misunderstand. Power must be positioned before it becomes necessary. Most professionals attempt to demonstrate authority when uncertainty becomes visible. Hierarchy evaluates authority when uncertainty is still forming. Small difference in timing, massive difference in leverage. This is the mechanism, delayed positioning. When positioning begins only after stakes appear, the system interprets your influence attempt as late-stage persuasion, not structural authority. And late persuasion rarely rewrites gravitational expectations. Not aggressively, not theatrically. Quietly, gradually, through patterns that expose your interpretive orientation long before stakes appear. Because the system cannot assign directional authority to thinking it is never observed.
And if your thinking only appears inside finished work, the structure cannot evaluate how you interpret uncertainty. It can only evaluate how well you execute clarity. Execution without visible interpretation produces a specific identity inside hierarchy. Reliable, competent, dependable, useful. All positive words. None of them signal directional gravity. Directional gravity appears when people begin anticipating your interpretation before decisions stabilize. When ambiguity appears and someone says, "Let's hear how they see this," not because you demanded influence, because the system has learned that your interpretation reorganizes complexity. That learning process cannot occur suddenly. It forms through repeated cognitive exposure, small observations, quiet framing, questions that reveal unseen constraints, connections between issues others treat separately. Each of these signals teaches the system something, not about your work, about your orientation. And this is the signal power actually evaluates. This is why waiting until influence becomes necessary is structurally ineffective. By the time influence becomes necessary, categorization has already formed. You are either someone whose thinking shapes direction or someone whose work stabilizes it. The cost of landing in the second category is rarely dramatic. No confrontation, no rejection, just gradual narrowing. The room still values your presence, but the evaluation range shrinks. You are invited when stability is required. You are absent when trajectory is decided. And the longer that pattern persists, the more natural it begins to feel to everyone involved, including you. Both roles are respected, but only one expands positional mobility, which means positioning yourself for power is not about asserting authority prematurely. It is about allowing the system to observe how you interpret complexity before pressure arrives. Not dominating conversations, not announcing strategic intent, simply ensuring that your orientation toward uncertainty becomes visible over time. Because repeated exposure reshapes expectation. Expectation reshapes categorization. Categorization reshapes trajectory. And trajectory is what eventually looks like power. If you only reveal your thinking once decisions appear, your interpretation arrives too late to reshape expectation. But if your thinking has been quietly shaping interpretation long before the stakes become visible, then when the decisive moment arrives, the room already knows how to use you. Not as executor, as orientation. And orientation is where influence begins. But most professionals never realize when positioning actually begins. They assume influence starts forming when they speak in strategic meetings. It usually begins much earlier, often in conversations that do not even appear important. A passing remark about a trend, a quiet observation about resource constraints, a question that reframes a discussion others thought was already settled. Small signals like these accumulate, not dramatically, gradually. Each time the system encounters your interpretation before a decision stabilizes, something subtle happens. Expectation begins adjusting. People start recognizing a pattern in how you think, not simply what you produce, how you interpret. Over time, that pattern becomes cognitively familiar, and familiarity creates gravitational pull. When a new issue appears, the room unconsciously searches for interpretive anchors it already trusts. That search rarely happens consciously. No one announces it. But you see the effect. Someone pauses mid-discussion and says, "Let's step back." Then they look toward a specific person. Not because that person outranks everyone else, because their thinking has previously clarified uncertainty. That moment looks spontaneous. It is not. It is accumulated exposure. The system has learned something about how that person orients complexity. And once that learning stabilizes, influence begins appearing earlier in conversations, not after conclusions, before them. This is the difference between participating in decisions and shaping how decisions become possible.
Most professionals spend their careers inside the first category. They enter discussions after the architecture is already forming. They optimize execution. They refine plans. They correct inefficiencies. All valuable. But none of it alters the underlying interpretive map, which means the room appreciates their competence while still orienting elsewhere when direction becomes uncertain. To reposition yourself before power becomes necessary, one shift must occur.
Your thinking must become visible earlier than your solutions. Understanding the mechanism changes where you pay attention. Look for the trigger moments, early-stage ambiguity, half-formed strategy conversations, resource discussions without clear direction. Most professionals treat these moments as premature. They wait for clarity. But clarity is the end of positioning. The individuals shaping trajectory are already active, while the problem is still undefined. Understanding the inversion. Executors reduce uncertainty after it appears. Directional actors reshape uncertainty before it stabilizes. One improves outcomes. The other changes trajectories. Hierarchy treats those signals very differently. Not louder, earlier. Earlier questions, earlier pattern recognition, earlier framing of trade-offs. This does not require seniority. It requires interpretive presence. Because hierarchy does not only evaluate results, it evaluates who helps the system understand what is happening before outcomes appear. Those individuals become orientation points, and orientation points become gravitational centers. When complexity rises, people look toward them automatically, not because they demanded authority, because the environment has already learned where clarity tends to emerge. This is where positioning for power actually begins. Not when decisions arrive, when interpretation starts shaping the environment that produces those decisions. And once that shift occurs, something subtle changes. You stop chasing influence. Influence begins forming around your orientation. By now, the pattern should be visible. Influence does not suddenly appear in moments of decision. It accumulates quietly before those moments exist, which leads to a more uncomfortable realization. Most professionals are not excluded from influence. They simply arrive too late to shape it. Because they wait for clarity. Clarity feels safe. Clarity feels legitimate. But clarity is usually the moment hierarchy has already stabilized its internal map, and maps determine movement. Centuries ago, Sun Tzu wrote, "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war." The line is often quoted in military strategy, but its deeper meaning applies perfectly to organizational power. Victory does not begin during confrontation. Victoria begins during positioning. The battle merely reveals which side was positioned correctly beforehand. Hierarchy functions the same way. By the time a visible decision arrives, the system has already determined whose interpretation will carry weight. The meeting is simply where the outcome becomes visible, not where it is formed. This is why attempting to demonstrate authority in high-stakes moments often feels strangely ineffective. Because authority signals were evaluated long before that moment appeared. Which brings us to the next mechanism. Pre-decision gravity. Pre-decision gravity forms when your thinking repeatedly appears during the early stages of uncertainty. Not after the problem is defined, before it is. This stage is easy to miss, because it rarely looks important. It looks like small conversations, loose speculation, unstructured dialogue, a hallway comment about a trend, an early concern about resource allocation, an observation about risk that is not fully materialized. Most professionals treat these moments as incomplete. They wait for formal discussion.
But those early signals are exactly where interpretive authority begins forming, because interpretation shapes the frame through which later decisions will be made. And whoever shapes the frame influences the outcome. Long before votes are cast or plans are written,
this is where another philosophical insight becomes useful. Hannah Arendt once observed that authority does not rely primarily on force. Authority emerges when people begin orienting their thinking around a particular reference point. In other words, authority forms when others begin using your interpretation as a guide. Not because they are instructed to, because it clarifies the environment. And clarity is magnetic. When complexity rises, people instinctively orient toward sources of interpretation that previously reduced confusion. That is how gravitational authority forms, not through assertion, through repeated orientation. This explains something many professionals find confusing. Why do some individuals appear to influence direction without formally holding power? Because their interpretations are already embedded inside how the system understands its problems. When a new challenge appears, their perspective feels immediately relevant. Not because they inserted themselves into the conversation, because their orientation has already shaped the conversation's starting point. Which brings us to the behavioral shift required for positioning. If influence forms before decisions appear, your signals must appear before decisions stabilize. That does not mean dominating discussions. It means shifting how you participate in early ambiguity. Most professionals react to ambiguity in one of two ways. They either withdraw until clarity appears, or they rush to stabilize the situation through execution. Both behaviors reinforce containment. Withdrawal removes interpretive visibility. Execution reinforces operational identity. Neither produces directional gravity. Directional gravity forms through something subtler: interpretive framing. Interpretive framing does not solve the problem immediately. It changes how the problem is understood. For example, instead of proposing a solution immediately, you ask, "What constraint is actually driving this issue?" Or, "If this decision succeeds, what secondary pressure will it create?" Questions like these do not simply advance the conversation. They reshape the mental model others are using to evaluate the issue. And mental models determine decisions. When your framing repeatedly reorganizes how complexity is interpreted, something quiet begins happening. The room slows down slightly when you speak. People check your reaction before moving forward. Your interpretation becomes a calibration point, not because of rank, because of pattern. Once that pattern stabilizes, influence begins appearing earlier in discussions, before solutions, before commitments, before direction fully forms. This stage is where power quietly accumulates. But it also introduces discomfort, because framing problems early often creates mild friction. You are interrupting the room's instinct to rush toward resolution. And many professionals avoid this moment instinctively. They prefer stabilizing the environment rather than altering its direction. But stabilizing environments reinforces executor gravity. Altering interpretive frames introduces directional gravity. Hierarchy treats those signals very differently. This distinction was understood centuries earlier by Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli observed that power rarely belongs to the person who simply maintains stability. It belongs to the person whose perspective shapes how stability is defined. Maintaining order preserves structure. Defining order reshapes it. Most professionals unknowingly specialize in preservation. They stabilize systems already in motion. But directional actors operate one layer earlier. They influence how the system understands what motion should occur. And once your thinking begins appearing at that level, something important changes. People begin involving you earlier. Not because you asked, because excluding you would now introduce uncertainty.
Your orientation has become part of the system's interpretive process. There is also a diagnostic signal most professionals miss. Watch when interpretation enters the conversation. If your perspective is requested after solutions begin forming, you are reinforcing execution gravity. If your perspective is requested before solutions appear, interpretive gravity is forming. Hierarchy treats those two moments very differently. The first says, "Help us implement it." The second says, "Help us understand." And understanding is where the trajectory begins shifting. This is why early interpretation often feels subtle. You are not making the final decision. You are influencing how the decision will eventually be understood. Each time it happens, the access ledger updates, another entry confirming where the system expects orientation to come from, another reaction receipt showing that when ambiguity appears, your thinking reorganizes the room. Over time, these small receipts accumulate into something powerful: expectation. And once expectation stabilizes, influence stops feeling like effort. It begins feeling structural. This is the real meaning of positioning yourself for power before you need it. You are not accumulating authority in advance. You are ensuring your interpretation becomes structurally relevant before pressure arrives. Because once pressure appears, the system defaults to the interpretive anchors it already trusts. And trust rarely forms in a single moment. It forms through exposure. Exposure creates familiarity. Familiarity creates reliance. Reliance creates influence. This progression is slow, often invisible while it is happening. But once established, it becomes extremely powerful. Because the room no longer evaluates whether you should shape direction. It already expects you to. And expectation is one of the strongest forces inside hierarchy. Once expectation stabilizes, influence becomes effortless. Not because you gained power, because the system has learned where orientation tends to emerge, which means something subtle has shifted. You are no longer trying to gain influence in critical moments. You are shaping how the system interprets the environment before those moments appear. And when that happens, something interesting occurs. You stop chasing authority. Authority begins forming around your interpretation. But there is another layer most professionals overlook. Interpretation alone is not enough. Interpretation must appear before structural pressure emerges. Because hierarchy behaves differently depending on when your thinking enters the environment. If your interpretation appears after a problem stabilizes, you are improving an existing frame. If your interpretation appears before the frame stabilizes, you are shaping the frame itself. That distinction determines who influences trajectory. This is why timing is the hidden variable in power positioning. The earlier your orientation appears, the more it shapes how the system understands the problem. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed that power rarely belongs to those who act only when events become visible. It belongs to those who shape perception before events fully form. Most people interpret that idea politically, but inside the hierarchy, it operates psychologically. Because perception determines who the system expects to interpret uncertainty. And expectation is where authority quietly begins. Watch how the access ledger updates in these moments. Someone introduces a new strategic concern. The room hesitates. You ask a question that reframes the issue, not aggressively, simply clarifying the constraint others overlooked. The room adjusts slightly. Nothing dramatic, but the ledger records the interaction. Another entry. Another reaction receipt confirming where interpretive gravity is forming. This is how pre-decision authority accumulates, not through large displays of leadership, through repeated exposure to how you interpret ambiguity. Over time, something subtle begins happening. People begin referencing your perspective before decisions stabilize. Not because you requested influence, because excluding your orientation now feels incomplete. This is the moment where positioning has begun working, and you will recognize it through small behavioral shifts around you. Someone pauses mid-discussion and asks, "What's your read on this?" Not your solution, your read. That difference matters. Solutions belong to executors. Interpretation belongs to directional actors. Hierarchy treats those signals very differently. But there is a cost to reaching this stage.
Because interpretive positioning introduces a small amount of friction. Framing problems early means slowing conversations that prefer quick resolution.
And many professionals instinctively avoid this tension. They return to stabilization. They resolve ambiguity quickly. They restore efficiency. Efficiency feels productive, but it quietly restores containment. This is why positioning for power requires behavioral restraint. Not aggression, restraint. Sometimes the most strategic move is not solving the problem immediately. Instead, you define the criteria through which the problem will eventually be solved. When you define criteria, you influence decisions without appearing to control them. That subtle distinction increases authority without triggering resistance. This behavioral pattern was also recognized by Sun Tzu.
He wrote that the highest form of strategy is shaping conditions so that outcomes become predictable before conflict begins. Inside organizations, that means shaping interpretation before decisions appear. Once interpretation stabilizes, decisions follow naturally. Which leads to a final observation about positioning. Power rarely feels like power while it is forming. It feels like small cognitive influence, a reframed conversation, a slightly altered assumption, a constraint introduced early enough to redirect thinking. Each of these actions appears minor in isolation, but collectively they reshape how the system understands its environment, and systems follow the interpretations they trust most. This is why the professionals who eventually hold the most influence rarely appear to be chasing it. They are not forcing authority. They are shaping orientation. When complexity increases, the room instinctively looks toward them, not because they demanded power, because their interpretation has repeatedly clarified uncertainty. That is the quiet architecture of positioning. And once that architecture forms, influence becomes far less dependent on persuasion. Because persuasion is what happens when interpretation arrives too late. True positioning happens earlier, long before authority appears necessary.